So I'm going to talk about all metrics today, about web native scholarship, decoupled journal. I'm going to suggest that we're on the brink of a second scholarly revolution, right? So obviously we need to do some background for that. So let's start off with some history. You heard I have BA history. I love talking about history. So at the beginning of scholarly communication, it was all just letters, right? People writing letters back and forth to one another. And that was kind of cool, right? Because we had a way of sharing our science with other people. It wasn't just alchemy where we were like hiding everything. But it didn't have a lot of downsides, right? Kind of slow, expensive, a lot of duplication. It was just the best we could do given the technology we had. So lo and behold, Henry Oldenburg comes along, who's the secretary of the Royal Society, right? And he says, hey, this is pretty inefficient. You guys sending letters back and forth every, all over the place every time. Why don't all y'all send your letters to me, and I'll bind them up. I'm sure that's how I said it, right? All y'all send your letters. So all y'all send your letters to me. I'll bind them up. I'll put them in a book, and I'll send that book, to all the other people, in the Royal Society. That way we can save a lot of time. We don't have to sort of be stuck, doing this individual duplication. So this was a great thing, right? He said, let's take the available technology, let's take the technology that's transforming the world. This technology is pretty impressive, and let's apply it to the problems that we have in scholarly communication. Of course, what Oldenburg did, it kind of stuck, right? We ended up using scholarly journals pretty heavily since then. I'm going to argue that there's a second revolution. The first revolution was Oldenburg's, and many people came after a scholarly journal. And then the second revolution is coming. So to kind of recap this, so the first generation was the letter, right? So the technology was pen and paper, real straightforward. The product was the letter, of course, and the filters were just personal, right? Like if someone sent you a letter and you knew them, you're probably going to open the letter, right? Then we had Oldenburg, he came up with a journal and said, well, let's harness new technology, printing press. We'll create articles, which originally were just letters, and gradually sort of formalized. And the old filters are going to break into the system, right? The old filters where it was just personal, you can't do that anymore in the era of a letter, right? Because eventually, you're going to get so many things, so many journal articles, you really can't just read all of them. You don't know everybody. So we have to have some other kind of filter. So the peer review process really started after World War II in earnest. And the idea behind the peer review process, as a community, let's nominate a couple people. And we'll say, these are the people whose judgments we trust. Editors, and then editors can nominate the reviewers. So we're going to nominate some people to speak for the community. And that was the peer review system. And I'm going to argue again, like I said, that there's a third system called this DCJ, or decoupled journal, I haven't reported in the list. And the decoupled journal is going to harness this new communication technology of the web. The product is going to be everything. That's the big difference. All kinds of things will be published on the web. And the filters are going to be alt metrics. And a lot of those words don't make sense, so we'll move on. So the first sort of objection to this is to say, wait a second. That revolution has already happened. Journals are already online. We're already using the web. It's already happened, right? The revolution is over. It's dead. There's nothing interesting here anymore. But I would argue that online journals are, in fact, just paper journals delivered by faster horses. There's not actual fundamental differences involved in the way we produce and the way we consume. We're still limited to the old sort of paper-based peer review filters, right? That can take many months, many years to actually sort of get finished. We're still sort of reading these PDFs, which might as well be a piece of paper, and also often printed out a piece of paper. There's just faster horses, no big fundamental change. The second revolution is not just, I'll read my PDF on a computer screen, it used to before. Instead, it's the change from a paper-native system to a web-native system. What do I mean by that? Let me give you a quick example. So this is an article that I published about the decoupled journal, interestingly enough. And I submitted it to the Journal of Computational Neuroscience, a special issue, and it makes me sound smarter than I am. I love Journal of Computational Neuroscience. That's like a smart person to publish it, right? So I submitted this thing, and I waited for a really long time, for like a year or something like that. And eventually I got really impatient. I said, guys, look, I got AD, I don't have time for all this foolishness. I wrote this on a Google Doc. Can I just make the Google Doc public, and then people can see it? And to their credit, they said, sure, why not? Knock stuff out, enjoy, right? So I did. I just flicked the button, right? And today, that's what publishing is, right? It's publishing, it's big capital P, it's a big involved thing. Publishing is flicking a switch from private to public on my Google Doc. That was it, and it's published, right? Now, of course, people need to read it, right? So I tweeted it out on my Twitter feed. Now, there's probably only about like 1,500 people, something like that, following me on my Twitter feed, right? Not that many people. In terms of the entire world, there's practically nobody, right? And it actually works quite nice because in terms of the entire world, there's almost no one who cares about my work, right? If we were really going to think, but realistically, right? And any kind of scholar or scientist, right? Like realistically, there's only a very small percentage of what cares, and those parts, those two sets of people following me on Twitter and people who care about my work, they match really well. Most of the people who care about my work do follow me on Twitter, or they know somebody who follows me on Twitter. So when I tweeted this out, I got tons of response. I got tons of peer review. I got my peers going to school doc, they're leaving annotations everywhere. oh man, I forgot like a really important reference. This person reminded me of it, let me know. I was like, wow, this is terrific. I'm getting peer review. I think not just from like 2 reviewers, but from like 8, and not from anonymous people, but from people that I trust whose opinions I'm like, wow, they kind of know what they're talking about. I really missed this. Moreover, I was also able to disseminate my work. So I went to a conference, and this guy, Johan Bolin, some of you may know him, was a big guy, big important guy in sort of scientific field, really smart guy. And I was talking about some of my work in the grad student, I'm trying to pitch myself and my ideas and everything. He was like, oh, hey, I read about this in your decoupled journal article. I found out about it by someone who follows you on Twitter. I thought, gosh, why would I even publish this in the journal? I've got my peer review. I disseminated to everybody that I need, right? And now this person who's really important in my field, they're learning about my ideas. That's what I wanted from a journal, right? So this is sort of, I think, one of the ways we can get publishing in a web native world. How about reading? How about consuming information in a web native world? Well, again, for me, I think Twitter is a really important part of my web native ecosystem. That's what I'll focus on now, but I think there's others. So here's my journal, right? I subscribe to a bunch of people. I listen to what they say, right? In some ways, this is a coda return to the letter-based filter, which was based on the person. I follow these people, and those people have interesting things to say. And as long as they keep saying interesting things, I will keep following them. Once they stop, they sort of shuffle off in the obscurity, and I don't use them in my feed anymore. But these people surface the things that I find useful. They are, again, my peers, and they are reviewing what I might read. And occasionally I'll read stuff that's not on there, and if it's really good, then I'll put it on my Twitter feed, and people see my filtered review feed. So web native scholarship is diverse, infinitely diverse. We can publish all kinds of things because publication is free. So what kinds of things am I talking about when I say diverse? Well, I would suggest there's 4 sort of categories of things we can publish today in the age of the web. I think it starts with data, then we get analysis, stories, and conversations. Let me give you an example real quick of each of these. So data, we can publish, these are 2 examples of data publication venues. So we got Drive, we got Figshare. All they do is publish data. Now, publishing articles, not publishing just data sets, right? And they give us all kinds of things. They can publish a figure, and we get a little metadata and all kinds of stuff associated. But I can publish my data, and then of course, as many of us in this room know, once that data is out there, other people can build upon that data and write their own publications much more quickly than they would be if there's we got 15 people all laboriously sort of compiling the same data set. What a horrendous waste of really smart people's time, right? That's kind of the ultimate crime. Take the smartest people we have, waste their time, like that's terrible, right? We want to get those people doing the smart things they know how to do. Let's gather the data one time and let's build amazing products off of that. So not only can I share my data, I can increasingly share my analysis that's built on the data, right? In the old days of social science research in particular, data analysis meant you take a graduate student, you put them in a room with SPSS and a data set, and you tell them keep clicking things until you get 0.05, then we'll publish, right? That was sort of data analysis in the old days. But increasingly, right? Increasingly, we're able to share actual scripts that formalize our analysis and that make our analysis self-replicable. So this is an example of our data set. This is by Carl Bodner, guy worth following if you care about sort of, I think, future sort of young generation science. He wrote this paper for Nature, or for someone, it wasn't for him. He wrote the paper for whoever. And then in the document, in the GitHub repository that he shared, so this is a software repository, it's got everything you would need to replicate that entire paper. He's got his data set. He's also got every line of statistical analysis he did, and the lines of the scripts that created his figures and tables. And then even the paper itself, even the prose, has got the markers in it so that when you hit run, you basically get the prose and it mixes in real time, sort of live. It mixes in live. I see a 15, I'm like a rank of 15. I was like, oh, 15 is pretty good. I don't know what got the judge. I don't know what you guys think. But anyway, yeah, so you could run the entire paper yourself, even the text. And if you were to change the data or change a little bit of the analysis, it would change it right there in the paper. So we've created an executable paper, right? The paper itself is something that can be run in real time. And it's not hard to imagine the reproducibility benefits that come from this way of disseminating science. Again, this is web native, right? We're not constrained by ink on paper. It's ink on paper is forever, right? Or at least for a very long time. We're not constrained by that anymore in the web era, right? We can execute the paper in real time, change a little bit of the data, change a little bit of the analysis, change a little bit of the prose, hit go, new paper, right? Just like that. Beautiful thing. Okay, so we got analysis data. So finally, stories, right? So we've always told stories in science, right? The paper is essentially a story about data, right? We've got the protagonist, me, the experimenter, we've got the antagonist, the ignorance, right? And here's me, like, sort of fighting ignorance and creating this wonderful, like, kernel of truth from my science, right? But imagine if we were as restricted in sort of the realm of fiction, in storytelling, the same way we're restricted by our media in science, right? In fiction, we've got short stories and novels and novellas and plays and movies and a million different formats or media that we can use to share our story. we don't think that's weird at all. That seems perfectly natural because different stories kind of want to be told in different ways. But in science, we've traditionally sort of only been restricted to one or two things. In humanities, even worse, most of it's monograph. Increasingly, we're going to have multiple ways to tell these stories. In the same way that we can tell them multiple ways in fiction, we'll be able to tell them multiple ways with all these different videos, and notebooks, and infographics, and slides, and a million different ways to be able to tell these stories. A million sort of different, diverse methods. And then finally, the conversation. That's kind of it kind of brings it around full circle because it starts with data. But really, if you think about it, data, and then you do the analysis, and then you finally publish a story, and then people talk about it, have a conversation. But really, that conversation is also where the data starts, right? Science really does start in conversations between colleagues. People having interesting ideas, having provocative ideas, talk with one another, talk with their students, talking with their lab. Right? This is the soil from which scientific innovation springs. And traditionally, we've been looking right, sort of the leaves, right? The soil is where the action really is. And people have known this for a long time. So you have people like, Derek Price, of course, the idea of visible college, right? Sort of arguing that scientific innovation is not, we don't see it, right? It's moving under the surface. But what's cool is that increasingly we can see it. Increasingly, we can publish units of conversation. So an example is this sort of Twitter feed, right? So this was from a thing I talked at a month or two ago. And as the talk is going on, there's people discussing the talk on Twitter, right? And so these are the kind of conversations that have always happened at conferences, that are happening at this very conference, right? You guys would after my talk, you guys would go out and be like, who's that Jason guy? Why does he talk so fast? I don't understand anything he's saying, right? You guys are going to have all of these discussions. You guys are going to have, don't worry, I know people. You guys are going to have all these discussions, right? And they're just going to fly away into the air, right? But increasingly, those discussions happen in places where they don't fly away in the air, where they leave a trace, where we can actually start to view them. I kind of think of the example of the old school scholarly sort of plane of ideas. You've got this like plane out of rock, rocky plane, right? This plane out of rock. And if we walk around, we want to leave traces of ideas. We kind of very intentionally sort of leave a pebble behind us, leave another pebble. That's a citation, right? We intentionally on purpose, we say, yeah, I was here, I use this idea, I use this idea, I use this idea. But in the future, and even today, as we are beginning to see now, we have a fresh fall of snow across that rocky plain. When we move around, we leave footprints. We don't have to do it on purpose, right? We're leaving these footprints. Just having the conversation leaves a record. And similarly on these places like Math Overflow, it's a question and answer site that people are asking math questions and getting math answers from, that a lot of eminent mathematicians are on. There's lots of examples of people citing Math Overflow questions in the peer-reviewed math literature. So it's becoming part of the conversation. So instead of moving paper products faster, we're creating, again to use this word, web-native science, because I think it's an important term. And web-native scholarship means that we can start making public instead of publishing. We just have capital P publishing, right? That capital P, right, that's a ritual. That's a dance that we go through, and we've done this and this and this and this. We sort of give a stamp and we say, this is publishing. But of course, the root of that word, publishing, means making public, right? And there's a lot of ways that we can make public. We can start thinking, instead of, let's go through the dance, do the ritual, get the capital P, instead of think, what did I actually care about? I care about making my ideas public. And we can start to do that in much more meaningful ways in a web-native world. Now, of course, it produces a very important problem, right? So in the age of the letter, it was very easy to filter. There wasn't many things coming to you. You don't get many letters, right? Well, nowadays with email, of course. It's a different story. When the printing press came out, right, and we sort of applied this new technology to scholarship, it created an enormous filtering problem. Many orders of magnitude more information coming at us, right? So we had to invent a new filter. We had to invent the peer review system as a new way to filter information. I think similarly, we're going to have to invent new ways to filter web-native scholarship because, again, we're going to increase the amount of available scholarship by several orders of magnitude. So we need new filters. We need web-native filters to go along with the web-native dissemination. And I think we can look at that two different ways. One is we can say, let's try and stomp this stuff down. Let's keep it out. Let's say there's still the publication system and all this other stuff. Let's keep that out of the official record. It's not real capital P published. It's just out in this sort of netherworld, this penumbra, right? This purgatory of scholarly, shuffling around figures that we don't have to really worry about. I think that's a terrible approach. That's the last thing. We don't want to close our eyes, plug your ears, and start going la 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 la. Instead, what we want to do is say, let's take this incredible, flood of web-native scholarly products, and let's actually use them to inform the filters that will in turn help us make sense of them. So that is confusing. What do I mean by that? I mean, let's start building metrics based on the information, the newly rich and nuanced information that the web is giving us. In the days of the web, we used bibliography. In the days of the first web, right, the scholarly with the web of citations, we use bibliometrics, right? And we said, okay, using bibliometrics, evaluating bibliometrics, using citation mining, we can say these ideas influence these other ideas, and consequently, we can sort of build a map of intellectual influence using the citation graph. And that was awesome. That's a really cool thing. Altmetrics is going to apply the exact same technique, the exact same approach, but instead of the extremely rarefied and extremely sparse graph of the citation graph, which we all know many things don't cite it, or they don't go to people who would cite it, blah, blah, blah. Instead, it'll use the rich graph of the web. So let's think when I say sparse and rich. So let me give you an example. So if we were to think just sort of, straight off the blue about impact, right, scholarly impact, we would probably be able to identify several dimensions of impact. Right? There's a lot of ways in which we have an impact. So I'll propose 2 dimensions right here, and I'm sure we could come up with a lot of other ones if we tried. But let's just start with 2, right? Let's say we can have scholarly and public audiences, right? So that's one dimension. Then we could also have different kinds of engagement. So a view is like kind of minimal engagement. I just looked at it. That's kind of cool. But you're moving up, like I said, well, not only did I view it, but I also discussed it. So I kind of took the time to talk to somebody about it. Even more than that, I could save it. Or if I save it, man, like I don't really want to save everything. So if I say this is probably meaningful, I could cite it where I'm sort of even attaching my name to it. And then finally I could recommend it where I'm actually attaching my reputation to it. I'm saying, hey, this is good, you should read it. So we can think of like these 2 dimensions of impact. And again, we could probably think more. So how good a job, so let's I guess because, I'm a social scientist, we have to make tables out of everything. So let's make a table out of these sort of 2 dimensions, right? And now let's think, how good a job are we doing of covering this impact landscape, right? Of mapping this 2-dimensional impact space. Not really awesome, right? Really, the kinds of things we focus on traditionally are old school sort of traditional citations. And they're really only paying attention to one very small component of this impact space. But with altmetrics, we can actually start, and altmetrics stands for alternative metrics, alternative to citation. We can actually start measuring the entirety of this impact space. We can actually start thinking more substantively about what impact means. So just to kind of go over a few of these, I guess I'll go over all real quick. If we start with recommended, we have recommendation like services like Faculty 1000. We have the popular press. It's kind of, if it's the New York Times saying, hey, I recommend you guys should probably read this. We could cite things in the traditional media, of course, but we could also, the public could cite things on Wikipedia. If my article about, crawfish reproduction is cited in a Wikipedia article about crawfish, well gosh, quite a lot of what the world knows about crawfish is now coming from my article. Because quite a lot of what the world knows about crawfish is coming from Wikipedia, right? If my work is discussed in a scholarly blog, right, that's a great way of showing how scholars are discussing my work. I could also say if it was discussed by my fellow scholars on Twitter, right? If I kind of have a list of who's scholars on Twitter. In the same way, sort of the general public could discuss things on public blogs or in public tweets. I could save things in Mendeley's site, like these sort of scholarly reference managers, or if I'm the general public, you can save something in Delicious. And then finally, even in reads, me and my co-founder Heather Pavovar have done some interesting research suggesting that, unsurprisingly, scholars are more likely to read PDFs, while general public are more likely to read HTML. So there is, it's by no means one-for-one split, but there is some signal there that we can even use even in the views of the research. So, and this is just a beginning, right? I mean, we can imagine lots of other things. The main point, the important point here is, as scholarship becomes more diverse, as we move into a world full of web-native products, thanks. Oh, my score is going down. I'm at 5 now. As we move into a world of web-native products, there's going to be a growing number of places we can look for evidence of impact. We can start to compile it all together. One thing that does this is ImpactStory. So we're an open source nonprofit startup, and we gather and share all metrics. And we're funded by the Alfred Sloan Foundation, as I mentioned, Heather Pavovar, my co-founder. And I encourage you all to check that out, or come see me. I got a sticker. I have many stickers. I can give you one of the stickers. So I think tools like ImpactStory are going to be really important as ways to gather all of the impact metrics together. And then what we do is sort of expose them via an open API. So if you want to embed them, if you want to build a CV around them, whatever it is you want to do, you can do all these kinds of things to show people the sort of totality, a much more complete view, a much more nuanced view of your impact, both on, like I said, your fellow scholars and the general public, which, both of these are important impacts in their own ways. So there's a lot of reasons why we might want to do altmetrics, but to me the most exciting one is that we can actually start to quantify what impact means. And that means that we can actually start to think about filtering, about the peer review filter through a completely different lens, in a completely different way. We can start to think about the network. I can start to think, if I got a tweet from 5 Fields medalists, 5 different fields, all of them said that my work is really great. does that make me feel happier or less happy than if I managed to convince 2 peer reviewers to get me into a top journal? I don't know, right? I mean, I got to think that in some ways the former is better because these people have put their reputation behind it and said, yeah, what Jason's doing is really good. I wouldn't hold your breath for that, but you know, I can dream. We can start looking at this network. So this is Johan Bohlm's work actually, where he's sort of categorizing a scholarly network based on article views. But we can build this network around people who tweet things, people who read things, people who save things in Delicious, save them in Mendeley, all these different ways that we can build this network-centric graph of scholarly influence, of scholarly impact. We can ask, for a particular scholarly product, who is reading it? Who is talking about it? Who is saving it? Who is recommending it? And are those people that we think have high authority? If my mom tweeted my paper, bless her heart, but it probably doesn't tell you much good about the paper, right? I mean, like, she's probably going to tweet what I do, right? But if, like I said, we have really high-ranking people, that maybe tells you quite a lot more. I think it's worth sort of thinking about the early days of the web here. You know, in the early days of the web, the idea was let's categorize the web. You know, Yahoo did this, a lot of librarians did this. Let's use the paper native systems that we're familiar with of manual curation. And let's say, you know, this is a good website and this is a bad website. We'll put them in 2 different categories, and then you, the searcher, will know, because we will have read every website. We'll have expert quality control that can guarantee its authenticity and its value. Well, of course, that was a complete failure, an utter failure, because there's way too many web pages, and expert time is expensive, and you can't spend expert time on reading every single web page. There's just not enough time, right? So Yahoo, that original model Yahoo had was sort of this curated directory model, complete failure. Who was successful in this role? Well, of course, Google was successful. Google was successful because they don't care what's on there. They don't read, they don't hire any experts. Who's the expert that Google hired? Google actually pays attention to the experts who are out there. They pay attention to y'all. They say, you know what, the rest of the world is full of experts. We don't got to hire them. They're already out there. They're already reading everything, particularly everything in their own specific area of expertise. Let's listen to the conversations that they're already having. Let's aggregate those together. And let's say, hey, you know, this page it's linked to by a lot of really authoritative pages. Probably good. Let's push it up in the search rankings. What if we could do that for scholarship? Right? We already have a scholarly network, right? We already have these invisible colleges of people who know each other. What if we could pay attention to the entire expanse of the scholarly conversation, and what every expert thinks and does in regard to every single product of scholarship? What if we had access to all of that, and we could mine all of that together, and we could say, hey, you know, this particular product, it has a lot of, you know, expert juice, right? It has, you know, Google, they talk about sort of the search juice, right? Google has this algorithm, they pour a little juice in one person, a little bit less than somebody else, based on the assessment of the community. Let's use the assessment of the scholarly community to rate things up and down in the same way that Google does. I don't think I have a lot of time to get these slides, but I think the idea is to essentially say, let's look at what the scholarly system does now, right? We have these sort of 4 traditional functions that article and are stacked on top of each other, and more or less we kind of do them journal by journal, or at least publisher by publisher. Each publisher has its own little stack that takes care of all these things. I think in the future, instead, we're going to see something that looks a lot more decentralized, a lot more like the web itself, a lot more web native. We're going to see an underlying level, a base layer, where people can store things persistently. Something like archive.org, you know, or institutional repositories, journal repositories. That's going to be there, right? The publishing, but that's boring. Actually, publishing like dissemination, you all have publishers, but what you do, if you were to look at your name, is incredibly boring. Publishing is pushing a button. Publishing is dumb. Publishing is commodity business. That's not what you call yourself. Realistically, what you do is you're in the filtering business. You're in the quality control business. The publishing is a solved problem. So how could we, if we were going to build quality control in a web native way, how would we do that? And I think increasingly it would become decentralized. So we would have a number of preparation services, a number of search services, a number of marketing services, and a number of assessment services. Thank you. Those assessment services could use all metrics. They could aggregate conversations. They could use traditional peer review. If someone wanted to say, hey, you know, give me a peer review stamp. Right? I'll go to Nature. I don't want to go through the rigmarole of having you publish. I got it published already. It's on the web. But I would love a stamp that says this is quality. Why couldn't they sell that stamp individually? And why couldn't I get theirs and one from you and you and you? And I could get 4 different stamps, one for the statistics, one for the figures, one for all different sorts of things, right? Once we think about doing things in a web native way, we're not constrained by paper, then we can actually publish unprecedented diversity of kinds of products and certify them in an unprecedentedly diverse way. So my argument is that the second revolution's already started, right? Give away my punchline. I'm terrible at this. So the second revolution started, right? So Chekhov, the playwright, he had this great line where he says, you know, when you bring a gun on stage, you have to fire it in a play, right? Because people people are expecting. So I think in the same way, once we have these alt metrics, once we start having this nuanced and diverse and rich way of thinking about impact, we're going to end up having to use them, right? We're already seeing this from funders and investors. So Chuck said, once the gun is on stage, it has to be fired. Once the metrics are on stage, I think they have to be used. And then check it off as a once. Eventually, I guess it's my fun. So I also wanted to make sure I thanked my funders and various other people who helped us a lot. And that's all. Thanks.